When she was born, her family tried to give her away. They asked around, relatives, neighbors, anyone who might take a second daughter off their hands. No one wanted her. And so, according to what she was told later, her parents considered one final option, digging a small hole in the ground and burying her.
我妈妈没有能力去抚养我，就想把我送人，都没有合适的人来养我。她可能到最后，她说是要把我给找一个坑给埋掉。
She survived, obviously. Her father's sister and brother-in-law, recently retired with no children of their own to look after, stepped in and said they'd raise her. It wasn't love. Exactly. It was logistics. They had time. They had just enough. And so she grew up in their home, fed sheltered, but not quite belonging.
姑父当时是刚退休，说要不就他们来养，反正刚退休没啥事儿，反正带小孩应该还是 OK 的。
This is a story about a woman, around 30 years old, living alone in Hangzhou, one of China's wealthiest and most fast-paced cities. She works in advertising, or at least she used to. She moved here from Shanghai, chasing what her interviewer promised would be a great opportunity. It wasn't, and now she finds herself earning less than she did 4 years ago, in a city she doesn't particularly like, surrounded by things she keeps buying to fill a space that has never quite felt like home. Her situation is shared by millions. She is part of a generation of young Chinese women who left their hometowns, moved to the big cities, and discovered that the promise of independence comes with a price tag they can barely afford. To understand her, you have to understand where she comes from. She was born into a poor, rural family in China, a family where being a girl was already a mark against you.
我家庭那边会有一点点的重男轻女。我出生的时候，我爸爸妈妈因为很穷嘛，家那边的条件很不好。我自己是一个女孩，所以说就没有那么多金钱去抚养我，然后再加上二胎当时是要交罚款的。
That fine she's referring to comes from China's family planning policies. For decades, most families were restricted to one child. Having a second, especially a daughter, in a culture where some families still favored sons, meant financial penalties that a poor household simply couldn't absorb. So she became in a very literal sense surplus. Her aunt and uncle took her in, but they were elderly, and their resources were limited. They could keep her alive. They could feed her, but emotional nurturing, education, the small luxuries of childhood, those were beyond what they could offer.
他们养我的时候已经是老人了，他们只看重你能不能健康生活，你能不能长大，你能不能吃好睡好，他们也没有办法很好的给我一些教育。
The arguments came anyway. Raising a child costs money, even a quiet one, and she could hear it. The friction, the resentment, the unspoken calculus of whether she was worth the trouble.
他们其实也没钱，他们只是刚退休，然后就会因为养我，然后会产生争吵。我好像总是在花钱，我好像总是在让别人来照顾我，就会觉得我好像很没有价值，像我的出身是一个错。
She was a child. She had just learned to write. And one day, she sat down and wrote a suicide note.
觉得我没有人爱我，爸爸妈妈不爱我，然后我感觉我在这个家里面也没有任何人喜欢我。刚刚学会写字的时候，我写了一封遗书，就希望离开这个世界。
She didn't go through with it. She grew up. She went to school, eventually left the small town, and like so many young people across China, migrated to the coasts in search of a life that might feel different. First to Shanghai, then a year and a half ago to Hangzhou.
可能我性格转变，可能是因为我后面去外面上学了吧。
Shanghai changed her. Not immediately, and not dramatically, but in the way that cities sometimes do, by simply showing you that other lives are possible.
没来上海之前吧，我都会觉得女生就只有谈恋爱结婚这一条路啊，就没有新的路走。就是我就看到了太多这种各种各样活法的女孩，就会发现其实女生不只是这一条路。在上海的这4年就会塑造我的思想。
She talks about the people she met in Shanghai with a kind of wistfulness. Friends who made sudden, seemingly irrational decisions that thrilled her precisely because they broke the script.
我在上海之前认识过一个女生，做着一份很日常的工作吧，但是她可能就会在1-2年后突然说 OK 我就裸辞了，然后她就去学佛了。他们就是会在某一个瞬间突然就会让我感受到说，原来你可以冲破很多很多的桎梏，原来人生还是可以这样子活的。但这种东西我觉得在杭州就很少。
It's worth pausing here to understand the difference she's drawing between these two cities. Shanghai and Hangzhou are both prosperous East Coast metropolises. separated by only about 100 miles. But in the Chinese imagination, they carry very different energies. Hangzhou, home to Alibaba and a booming tech and e-commerce ecosystem, is often seen as a place you come to hustle, to grind, to build something. Shanghai, by contrast, is a place where you might work just as hard, but there's a cultural permission to also live, to experiment, to be eccentric, to care about art and style and pleasure, even if you can't afford to stay forever.
上海市我这辈子都不可能留下来，所以说还不如就完全的去享受当下。就杭州对于很多年轻人来说，他们是我奋斗，我努力奋斗是可以留下来一个城市。
She came to Hangzhou because someone told her the money would be better. It wasn't.
当时在上海应该是1万多吧，然后我来这边的时候，面试官的老师跟我说，底薪虽然低，就是一单的这种所谓的奖金会很高。我来之后发现奖金根本就不发，就导致我可能我这1年多基本上都是在拿底薪，然后我就会发现是假的，不到1万吧。
To put that in context, 10,000 yuan a month is roughly $1,400 US. In a city like Hangzhou, where rents are rising and the cost of living isn't far behind Shanghai's, that money evaporates fast.
房租、我基本的吃饭、买衣服、日常开销，这3部分加起来已经将近快要6000了，根本存不下。
She's been working for nearly 10 years. She has almost no savings. And this is where her childhood catches up with her. Because she knows exactly why she can't save. She calls it revenge spending, a term she uses with complete self-awareness, without any illusion that it's rational.
就是感觉我工作了之后会有点报复性消费，我要买好看的衣服、好看的鞋子，我要装点我自己，所以说就花销会很大。我之前就是小时候太物质匮乏了，我太需要这些东西了，通过拥有这些东西来让我有一些安全感。
When the camera crew visits her apartment, a shared rental in a slightly upscale Hangzhou neighborhood, they find a small room packed floor to ceiling with belongings, clothes, shoes, bags, books brought over from her old Shanghai apartment. She pays 1,500 yuan a month for this room, about $200. It's not much space, but it's hers.
所以你出来工作过后才拥有你第一个卧室。
算是我自己名义上自己的家，因为我一直觉得我是没有家的概念的。
There's a particular kind of loneliness in that sentence. Not the loneliness of being alone in a city. Millions of young Chinese migrants know that feeling, but the loneliness of never having had a place that was yours to begin with. No childhood bedroom. No corner of a family house. Her room in Hangzhou, stuffed with possessions she can barely afford, is the first space that has ever been hers alone. And she fills it compulsively, as if the sheer volume of objects might someday add up to belonging. And then there's the question of going home for the holidays. In Chinese culture, the Lunar New Year is the gravitational center of family life. The one time of year when hundreds of millions of migrant workers return to their hometowns, bringing gifts and cash to demonstrate that the year away was worth something. She feels this obligation too.
其实我们家的传统是过年我会比如说把一些钱我带回家，然后给我爸妈，我觉得是我的责任。
The parents she's referring to here, the ones she brings money to, are the biological parents who once considered burying her. The relationship is complicated in ways that don't translate neatly. There's a cultural expectation of filial duty in China that persists regardless of the emotional quality of the relationship. You support your parents because they are your parents. That's the rule. Whether they loved you is a separate question. And this burden follows her into her romantic life too. She's been dating, or trying to, and she describes an emotional state that is becoming increasingly common among young people in Chinese cities.
约会，因为很多时候是
只是约会还是确定关系那种？
确立关系的很少因为我很难跟别人确立关系。在上海的话，一年有个7、8个。
She describes a dating culture, especially prevalent in Shanghai, built around what she calls informal relationships. You can do everything a couple does. You go on dates. You're physically intimate. But you never put a label on it. You never say this is my boyfriend or this is my girlfriend. It's a deliberate ambiguity, and she has a theory about why.
在上海，大家不喜欢确立关系，大家喜欢搞什么非正式关系。除了那个名，你可以做所有的实。我们会担心说，会不会一旦确立了，我们就少了很多自由度。我觉得不是开放，我觉得是大家需要亲密关系，但是他们又同时自己本身的安全感又不太够。
She pauses, and then says something that cuts closer to the bone.
大家都很累，都很有压力，我们就不想要再有什么束缚和压力，我们就想说我们轻松一点，享受当下。你可以短暂的通过这段关系去做一个放松，去做一个缓解，去做一个逃离。
There's a generation of young Chinese people who have internalized a very specific calculation. To a relationship, to a city, to a career path, is a luxury they cannot afford. Not because they don't want it, but because the ground beneath them feels too unstable to build on. When your salary barely covers your rent, when your parents have no pension and will eventually need your support, when the economy is slowing and the job market is tightening, the idea of settling down starts to feel less like a milestone and more like a trap. And for her, the math is even more brutal. She mentions, almost in passing, that a previous boyfriend's family rejected her, not because of who she was, but because of what she came with.
如果我这个情况跟我结合的话，可能男方家庭就要负担我爸爸妈妈的养老，就要把我的原生家庭都抛弃掉。
In China, marriage isn't just the union of two individuals. It's the merging of two family economies. When your partner's parents have no retirement savings, no government pension, no social safety net, marrying that person means inheriting their family's financial burden. Some families accept this, others don't. And for women from poor, rural backgrounds, this becomes an invisible tax on their romantic future, a deficit they carry through no fault of their own. She was asked to abandon her family in order to be accepted by someone else's. She didn't. On the day of filming, the interviewer takes her on a small experiment. He gives her 100 yuan, about $14, and asks her to spend it however she wants, without hesitation. She says she wants to buy flowers and give them away to strangers on the street.
一个是说是去花店买花，看100块钱最多能够买到多少枝花，就会找一个这种人流量很多的街，然后我就去派这些花。
They do it. They go to a flower shop, buy as many stems as 100 yuan will get, and she starts walking down a busy Hangzhou sidewalk, offering flowers to passers-by. An older woman, a young couple, a student. She hands them out with a gentleness that feels practiced, as if giving things to strangers is easier for her than receiving them from people she knows. Along the way, they stop and ask other people on the street the same question. If you found 100 yuan and had to spend it right now, what would you do? The answers are small, ordinary, and quietly revealing.
如果是在我没吃饭的情况下，肯定会选择去买好吃的呀。
跟我老公去喝口小酒，快3年没有一起喝过酒了，就可能是一种仪式感吧。
100块钱给更需要人。
买一张离杭州比较近的车票，逃离一下当下这个比较焦虑的环境。
现在立马100块
充话费，因为我早上刚收到话费不足15元。
迦南那面包店
啊，对啊，全部买甜品。
工作很辛苦。
100 yuan, $14, for one person. It's a drink with a husband she hasn't toasted in 3 years. For another, it's a train ticket out of the anxiety. For another, it's keeping the phone on. These are not extravagant wishes. They are the smallest possible comforts. And even those feel like decisions that need to be justified. Back in her room later that evening, with the flowers gone and the street noise fading, the conversation turns inward again. She picks up a book from a stack she brought from Shanghai. Ask the right questions. A book about critical thinking. She laughs and says the interviewer probably needs it more than she does.
我来杭州之后因为太焦虑了，不怎么读书，这些书都是我从上海的那个合租的屋里面搬过来的。
She talks about her childhood again, about how, whenever she was hurt or upset and tried to seek comfort, the response she got was blame.
其实我觉得我从小生活中可能我受了委屈，我觉得我应该去得到安慰，他们都会说是你的问题啊，你不应该那样做呀。
She learned, very early, that her pain was not something the world would hold gently. That lesson has stayed with her. It shows up in the way she shops, filling her room with things that can't leave. It shows up in the way she dates, keeping everything light, undefined, disposable. It shows up in the way she talks about her future, always provisional, never rooted. When asked whether she'll stay in Hangzhou, she's definitive.
选择一个城市，就是要选择这个城市背后的它所代表的一些气质。我应该不会在杭州很久，因为我不喜欢杭州。
She says it like someone who has always been moving. From her parents' house to her aunt's house. From her aunt's house to school. From school to Shanghai. From Shanghai to Hangzhou. Always the next city. Always the next room. Always the hope that the next place might be the one that finally feels like staying. There's a moment, late in the conversation, when the interviewer asks her, if you had 24 hours left to live, what would you do?
今天会跟我的室友吃一顿饭，再去跟我约会的男生道别。接下来的时间我要留给我自己。
Roommates. A man who isn't her boyfriend. And then, herself. Notice the order. The roommates come before the romantic interest. The romantic interest comes before solitude. And solitude comes last. Not as loneliness, but as the final luxury. The thing she has had the least of, and maybe values the most. She arrived in Hangzhou a year and a half ago. On her second day. Riding an elevator in an office building. She overheard a young woman complaining to a friend about a job interview. The position was for a live streamer. 1 day off per week. 4,000 yuan a month. Roughly $550.
当时就让我觉得很震撼，2025年了，还有这种工作在杭州存在，我就觉得好震惊，好可怕。
And then she said something that stayed with the camera longer than anything else.
就是我觉得在杭州的大家都好命苦啊，都好辛苦啊。
She's not talking about herself anymore. Or maybe she is. Maybe she's talking about all of them. The girl in the elevator. The woman who hasn't had a drink with her husband in 3 years. The grad student who wants a train ticket to anywhere else. The person who just needs to keep their phone turned on. In Hangzhou, a city synonymous with China's digital economy, with the future, with success. She sees something that doesn't make it into the branding. A generation of young people who came here to build something, and are finding that the scaffolding can barely hold their weight. She says she believes people can start over at any point. That you can enter any industry. That you can begin from zero whenever you choose.
我现在的想法就是人是可以到任何行业的，是完全可以随时从零开始的。
She says this with conviction. But you can hear, beneath the words, the sound of someone who has started from zero too many times already, and is still looking for the place where zero finally starts adding up. As they leave her apartment that night, she walks them down through the neighborhood. There's a stray cat she stops to greet. There's the sound of the city winding down. She's 30. She has no savings. She has a room full of things. She has a dating life with no labels. She has parents who need money she doesn't have. She has a city she doesn't love. And she has a conviction. Fragile. Stubborn. Possibly the only thing holding her together. That somewhere, in some version of the future, it gets better. Whether that's true, whether starting from zero is freedom or just another word for falling, is a question she'll keep answering with her life. The spring is warm in Hangzhou. The light is soft. And she keeps moving.